Before America was a country of diners, drive-ins, and supermarkets, it was a land of plantations. And on those plantations, while wealth and power were built in the big houses, survival was crafted in the slave quarters. The story of the food enslaved Africans ate isn't just a chapter of hardship, it's a story of endurance, creativity, and identity. Because through that food, they preserved pieces of their homeland, adapted to brutal conditions, and unknowingly helped shape what we now call American cuisine. Today, on YouRemeber, we uncover the untold truth about the food of slaves on plantations, what they ate, how they survived, and how their cooking left a permanent mark on America's table. Life on a plantation meant total control, over labor, over movement, and even over what was eaten. Food was not a right, it was a ration. Owners and overseers provided enslaved people with meager portions of food each week, usually cornmeal, a bit of molasses, lard or fatback, and maybe a small piece of salted pork or fish. In many plantations, this was all a person would receive to last them 7 days of grueling labor under the sun. There were no fruits, no fresh vegetables, and almost never sugar or flour. Those were reserved for the master's table. It wasn't enough to live well. It was barely enough to live. But here's where survival became art. Enslaved Africans transformed these scraps into meals that sustained body and spirit. They roasted cornmeal into ash cakes, boiled it into mush or grits, and fried it into hoe cakes. With salted meat or fish, they created stews rich with flavor when possible, stretching small portions to feed entire families. Whatever could be gathered, turnip greens, wild onions, okra, or herbs, was added for taste and nutrition. From hardship came invention. What slave owners saw as rations, enslaved people turned into recipes, often cooking in communal pots over open fires, sharing not just food, but fragments of hope. Though stripped of almost everything, enslaved Africans carried memories of the foods they once knew. Okra, black-eyed peas, rice, yams, sorghum, all ingredients brought from or inspired by African cooking, found their way into plantation life. In coastal South Carolina and Georgia, African women skilled in rice cultivation used their knowledge to shape one of the most profitable crops in the South. In Louisiana, African, Native American, and European influences merged into rich dishes that would later inspire Creole cuisine. In every bite, there was memory. Cooking became quiet resistance, a way to remember who they were when the world tried to make them forget. While field slaves ate from rations, a few worked inside the plantation homes as cooks, servants, or butlers. In the big house kitchens, enslaved cooks prepared elaborate meals for the master's family. They learned European techniques, but blended them with African flavors and traditions. These cooks were some of the most skilled people on the plantation, yet they received little credit. The fine dining that defined Southern plantation life was often created by enslaved hands. Dishes like gumbo, jambalaya, fried chicken, and cornbread all trace back to this exchange. An invisible culinary legacy built under oppression. When possible, enslaved families planted small gardens near their cabins. These plots, though small, were sacred spaces. They grew greens, sweet potatoes, peppers, beans, and sometimes fruit trees. These gardens meant independence, a tiny act of control in a life otherwise controlled by others. Fishing, hunting, and trapping also supplemented their diets. Men would catch fish from rivers, hunt rabbits or raccoons, and gather wild berries or nuts. Every meal from these efforts was one less meal that depended on the overseer's ration. In those gardens and woods, food became freedom. Sunday for most enslaved people was the only day without work. It was a day for rest, worship, and, if possible, better meals. On Sundays, families came together to cook. They turned cornmeal into bread, boiled rice with vegetables, and sometimes shared a rare treat, like a chicken or rabbit. These moments mattered. They gave families a sense of community and dignity. Around the pot, laughter, music, and prayer turned into strength. Food became the bond that kept humanity alive. But not every story was one of survival through creativity. Many plantations used food as a tool of punishment and control. Rations could be withheld, spoiled, or reduced as discipline. Hunger was often weaponized to break spirits. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were constant threats. And yet, even in starvation, enslaved people found ways to share. Some risked brutal punishment by sneaking food to the sick or children. Others bartered or traded secretly with poor white farmers or free blacks for extra ingredients. This quiet defiance was as brave as any act of rebellion. When slavery ended, many freed people continued to cook the only way they knew. using the same ingredients and techniques from the plantations. Over generations, these survival foods evolved into comfort foods: cornbread, greens, black-eyed peas, fried catfish, gumbo, sweet potato pie. What once symbolized survival became a symbol of identity. These recipes were passed down through generations, shaping what we now call soul food, a cuisine that carries the taste of both suffering and resilience. So, when we sit down to a bowl of collard greens or rice and beans, we're not just tasting Southern cooking, we're tasting history. Every plantation feast, every banquet in a mansion, every meal on a fine Southern table was prepared by enslaved hands. The cooks, the gardeners, the hunters, the fishermen, they sustained not only themselves, but also the entire plantation economy. Their knowledge of spices, seasoning, and balance turned basic ingredients into meals that defined a region. Yet history rarely remembers their names. Their food traveled from the cabins to the big house, from plantations to restaurants, and eventually to American culture itself. The taste of survival became the taste of a nation. When we talk about the food of enslaved people, we're not just talking about recipes. We're talking about endurance, culture, and creativity, born out of unimaginable suffering. It's a reminder that American history isn't just written in wars and politics, it's written in kitchens, gardens, and fields. The food of slaves on plantations tells us something profound, that even in bondage, people created, shared, and remembered. They turned hunger into hope, and out of that hope came flavors that continue to nourish America centuries later. The story of America is full of triumph and tragedy. But few stories capture both like this one, the story of how enslaved people took the little they were given and turned it into something that would outlast the plantations themselves. Their food was never just food. It was memory. It was defiance. It was love, carried in pots of stew and in the smell of bread over open fires. And even now, every time we taste the dishes born in those kitchens, we taste the strength of those who endured. Because history isn't just in books, it's on our plates, in our stories, and in the voices that say, "You remember?"